Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Board Gaming Doctor. My name is Phil, and I'll be your Board Game Doctor today. So, this is something that I've been thinking about doing for a while. For those who don't know, I've not always been on YouTube. I started on the podcasting platform for just audio podcasts, and so I have about a year and a half's worth of content of game reviews and topical discussions that I did before I switched over to the YouTube platform. And with the recent addition of the episode where I talk about my top 10 favorite designers, I thought back to an episode that I did on the podcast solely on the top 10 reasons why I enjoy Uwe Rosenberg and his games and why they feel unique. And so I wanted to put that on YouTube for those who are interested in listening to it. I'm not going to do anything special with the editing for time reasons, but I just wanted to put that out there in case you wanted to listen to that as a wrap-up to the top 10, since I stopped at my number 2 and go into more detail. I would basically explain the same things in this episode with that particular spot for number 1. So, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to myself. This is all the way back from November of 2023, almost a year ago from the time of this recording. So, top 10 reasons why I enjoy Rosenberg games. But in this episode, I wanted to do something more topical rather than review. And I wanted to talk about the top 10 reasons why Uwe Rosenberg games are my favorite. Another way that I thought about this topic was 10 reasons why Uwe Rosenberg games feel unique to me. But with so many games out and so many designers publishing new games, I'm bound to find a lot of these aspects in other games as well. Perhaps some of them influenced by Uwe Rosenberg's style. And so I changed the title a little bit to be more of why, these games and why these aspects of his games are my favorite, what draws me back to them multiple times, what gives them the ability to be replayable, etc. But a lot of these things I'll try to mention and give examples for the reasons that I give, both with Uwe Rosenberg games, but perhaps in other games that come to mind as well. This is going off the cuff, but I hope you enjoy this list, and perhaps if you find a lot of these aspects of these games in common and what draws you in, I'd love to hear your thoughts about what makes Uwe Rosenberg games delightful and unique and favorable to you. And you can do so in the comments as I post this to Board Game Geek in my blog. So, and these are in no particular order. These basically came from the top of my head as I have been stirring this idea around for a couple of weeks now. But the first one, and I think one of the things that makes Uwe Rosenberg games unique to most people, is the feeding mechanism. I've seen this mechanism in other games, obviously, before or perhaps after Agricola was introduced to the board gaming world. But this mechanism of having to feed your family, as well as continue to, gain points in various ways, was a hallmark of the original Agricola, leading to it being called Misery Farm and being a very tough game to get wrap your head around and become good at. And so a lot of his games since then include this mechanism, all the way up to Ediwa, the latest game that he published last year. Once again, I can't comment on Plantanubo or Tangram City. I don't believe there is a feeding mechanism in those games at all. But I really like this mechanism, and I may refer to this a little bit later on the list too, but the fact that you are trying to solve this particular puzzle of getting enough food to feed your workers, and just using Agricola as the base example, but you can apply this to his other games as well. In addition to having to figure out what to feed, you're also trying to figure out how to progress forward in the game, to either build an engine or to accomplish certain objectives, and basically to be competitive in the game while avoiding the negative consequences of not feeding your family. or your workers, etc. Recently, I played Edua with my friends. I taught them this game. I played it at 4 players, and it was really fun. I really enjoy, and this is my first time playing it multiplayer as well. So I guess this is a mini review of Edua. But we had such a great time, and the time frame was manageable. Everyone was really engaged all the way to the end of the game. I ended up losing that game, even though I taught it, and I lost by a considerable margin. But the comments that I was listening to as I was surrounded by my friends playing was the agony, the I guess righteous agony of realizing, oh, okay, I now understand how this game works. I have 3 moves per round to 1, make sure I have enough food to feed my families, to make sure I have enough resources to fulfill the breeding requirements for that round, and 3, how to get points basically and progress my game forward. And so the tightness of decisions, mostly not, and this is game dependent, of course, but I get the feeling that a lot of the games have not too many options, in front of you. This is obviously not referring to like Feast for Odin, but I feel like the decision space is manageable, right? The decisions that you have in front of you are pretty straightforward. They're not as elaborate or convoluted as perhaps some games are. The puzzle is in front of you, and it's easy to know what you can do and what you can't. The complexity comes in from understanding that you have different objectives that you need to fulfill, and choosing to sacrifice some versus others, or in what order to place your workers to fulfill those objectives before anyone else can, is where that delicious tension resides. And so I think this is best exemplified in Agricola, but it could be seen all the way up to his latest design in Edua as well, where the tightness of decisions in my opinion, more tamed decision space. It doesn't feel sprawling. It doesn't feel like I have to solve everything and find every bit of efficiency right at the get-go. It kind of leads into itself a little bit more and kind of progresses through the game, which I guess is one aspect of his games that I don't think I have mentioned on my list yet, but that I guess I will talk about it a little bit, but like that progression, easing you into the game while introducing these different tension points, makes a first play of a game of his accessible or approachable, but then it lends to it being more complex than you perhaps originally thought of, and the complexity comes in from replaying this game and getting better at it, rather than understanding all of the rules at first and being overloaded at the beginning as you play these games. So I guess all that to say is that the feeding mechanism kind of exemplified and represented this thought that his games are easy to learn and hard to master, basically. Reason number 2, the thematic integration of most of his games, for them being Euro games, is quite remarkable. And this comes from the big picture and the big thematic aspect of each game, as going down to certain mechanisms, right? And so the first couple of examples that I can think of, first is Edua, the thematic integration of the bat action that you have, right? Where you get to take a free bat action after you place a worker, flying those bats out of your village back to their cave, and being able to plant more trees in the process because of that lends itself to the theme of the game, where having more bats in your village leads to the renaturization of your village. Hallertau is another game where, as you fulfill the requirements that each of your industrial buildings have in your community, you can push those rocks, those boulders that are next to your community board, over as you start to expand your village and grow the amount of workers that you have available, making your region of Hallertau more prosperous. A lot of these small individual things lead to a better understanding of the theme of as a whole. And once again, turning back to Agricola, It's medieval farming is the theme, and in the text of describing the game, like on the back of the box, it says farming isn't easy, right? And Agricola is not an easy game. It simulates what it might feel like to be an average farmer in the medieval times so well, and I feel like a lot of Euro games these days are so abstracted to the point where the theme doesn't matter as much, right? I think there's a lot of care and detail that have been put into Uwe Rosenberg's games to make the theme represented feel integrated with the game itself. A lot of his games, such as A Feast for Odin and Fields of Arla, also have handy inserts, and Ediwa as well, booklets that describe the research that goes into each of these games and the ways that the mechanisms of the game represent those themes as a whole. I could continue to list a lot of these games, and a lot of these games too come from the personal life of Uwe Rosenberg. I believe Or at Labora was inspired by his trip. I think it was a honeymoon or just a trip with his family to the region that inspired the game Or at Labora, and so on and so forth, right? Ediwa, taking inspiration from this story in Ghana about the mayor of a real place, in this region of Ediwa, using bats to help and teaching people to use bats or have a good relationship with bats to be able to renature that region. And so, yeah, I think a lot of care has been taken to research the theme, and I could get the sense, I want to do some more deep dives into the designer diaries of these games and to see the inspiration from the theme and the topic at hand and how that inspires the mechanisms. And so for me, like, thematic integration is peak when it comes to Uwe Rosenberg games. And kind of along that line, my third reason why Rosenberg games are my favorite include the closeness with agriculture and nature in that sense with these games. I have found that, and I probably could do an episode of my favorite themes of all time, but one of them is definitely nature. And this could be very broad. You can think about games like Ark Nova and dealing with animals and zoos. You have Earth, which deals with the plants and whatnot. Mechanisms aside, the theme often is what grabs my attention when there are so many options of new games, and old games for that matter, clamoring for my attention and for the opportunity to play it and potentially buy it. So I'm very drawn towards the theme of farming and agriculture and nature, I think primarily because of what I used to play back in the day when I was a child and a young adult or young teenager. One of my favorite video games growing up was Harvest Moon. And I remember playing that on the GameCube and just enjoying the time that I spent in that game, not having, a big narrative story to follow or anything. It was mostly just fulfilling small objectives, making sure my farm was doing well and was growing, and then having a personal life as well. It was very cozy. And I'm not much of a, farmer or gardener myself. We do grow some crops here and there, but I really have enjoyed this theme, and because of that same feeling of coziness that comes from when I used to play those games back in the day. I don't play those types of video games anymore since I don't have the time, and I want something more substantial, I suppose, and that's where these board games come to play, where you can sit down for a couple of hours and engage with a cozy theme, such as farming, and have a session where you come out of it either winning or losing, or having some sort of story to say, building a tableau that looks neat, and having a story that you can tell about that particular play, where I guess all of the plays in Harvest Moon kind of blend together, and you can only look back after a couple of sessions and say that you've accomplished something story-wise or otherwise, right? So board games have been for me a way to, with limited time, engage with a theme and mechanisms in a sit-down, playable session that I could do over and over again, get better at, but also and not feel like I'm diverting so much time to a single game or a single game, like a video game. Recently with not Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom, a lot of board game time was taken away because I was playing that game, and I don't regret it. But a lot of hours were put into that single game, where if I spent the same amount of time and the same number of hours playing a whole variety of games, I could have had a lot different experiences that I could talk about, right? And that's why I love board games. But coming back to a board game and trying one for the first time, for that matter, is really dependent for me on the theme, because a lot of these mechanisms start to feel the same as you grow and go deeper and deeper into this hobby. You start to find that a lot of similarities tend to occur, which makes learning them easier. But if you have that thematic catch and hook to bring you into that game, then all the better. And so a lot of Uwe Rosenberg games have that hook that I really enjoy, and it just makes me feel cozy as I look on the board, look at the artwork, and think about what I'm trying to do mechanically as well as thematically with these games. And so that is my third reason, with the themes of the games themselves being mostly as a whole related to agriculture or nature, or kind of cozy things, like building out your little nook of Bavaria in Glass Road, or your farm in Fields of Arla, right? It all depends. It's just really fun for me. Okay, reason number 4 is the arc of gameplay. The progression or the story that is told, I think, is what brings me back. And the reasons that I think about this include, say, Agricola, right? You have a very set beginning, mid, and late game. The beginning of the game, to some, might feel scripted, but to me it feels familiar, and it's a part of the game where you lay down the foundation for the rest of your game and make sure you have a feeding engine, and you race to get a new room or to get an extra family member, etc. Right? In the mid game, you're expanding your farm and then finishing it off and playing cards that give you bonus points, etc. throughout the game, and capping it at the end of the game, right? In A Feast for Odin, for example, you have the beginning of the game where you kind of race to get ships, if you're following the traditional strategies, and then you explore and gain new islands that you've explored, as well as the longhouses, etc. by the second and third turn, and then you're kind of building off of an engine, playing cards, and taking those most efficient actions to fill those islands, right? And then you emigrate near the end of the game. And that is not true for every game, but you can kind of say that these games kind of follow a very familiar pattern. There are games that feel a little bit more sandbox in nature, talking about Caverna and Fields of Arle, but the more that I play those games, the more that I feel like there is a story being told mechanically, not just thematically, as you follow those games. I think one of the best examples, too, is Hallertau, where it's explicitly told to you what you need to do each round, how many resources that you need to be able to move a certain community house, or a certain industrial building, to move your community house to the right. And so the arc of how you go about doing that stays the same, and there's a similar story that's being told throughout the game, and every single repetition of the game can be the same, but it's those little details of how you get to there, to these little checkpoints, basically, these little objectives, is what makes each game feel unique, despite the story, the same story that is being told, basically. And so I've really enjoyed the arc and the familiarity of these games, because for me it makes it easier to be thematically integrated, building off of my previous point, and to also get better at the game mechanically, because I know what to expect. I learn different strategies to achieve these certain points in each story, so that way I can reach the end of the game with a better score than last time. and these games, for me, that do follow a very similar game arc, make it feel cozy. make it feel like I'm coming back to something that I know inherently, and now I'm just teasing apart the certain nuances that each game delivers, whether it's at the beginning of the game and how the game is seated randomly, or what cards I'm giving, what tiles are available to me, in what order. And those little details is what makes each game feel different and unique. And those small ripples, I feel like it can create waves of how the game ends up looking like, your tableau at the end of the game, or how many points you've gotten compared to some other opponents, and what their boards look like as well. What the middle of the board, the central board looks like as well, can really change and make the game feel different. And I think it's amazing how such games that are well versed per se with those small tweaks based off of randomness or chance and player experience as well can still create different feelings and different outcomes each time you play that game. There are other games that take a different approach. Perhaps there are some Rosenberg games that do this, but I feel like a lot of non-Rosenberg games vie for the wide spread of different resources or tiles or board states, basically, at the beginning of the game to make it feel different each time, or they give you different objective cards or what have you, private or public, or otherwise, that kind of nudge you very strongly in a certain direction each game, and rely on those to make it different. In Rosenberg games, I don't always get that feeling. I think you might argue that the cards or tiles that are given to you personally can dictate what type of game you're going to have. But the more I play these games, and for one of the reasons that I will mention later on, the overall arc or how a game is played can be scripted. The objectives, if you are playing at a higher level, start to become bottlenecked and become the same. And it's just how you get there. You can do so in creative ways, or how you get there first as well is where the game actually lies after you've understood and played the game multiple times. And so I feel like his games do tend to follow this type of script in order to give it that replayability. And so, so the arc of gameplay is very unique to me, or at least is what appeals to me when I play his games. The fifth item that I wanted to talk about is a very specific mechanism, and that's the resource wheel. We see this first introduced in games like Glass Road and Ora et Labora, and recently brought back in Oranienburger Canal, one of my favorite games ever. And I just really enjoy this unique mechanism that I hardly see outside of these games of his. I know that some other mechanisms of his have become quite popular, such as, well, he did not invent worker placement, but I think he did a lot to lay the foundation for that particular mechanism to take off and become very much a staple in today's Euro games especially, but also polyomino placement. I think he had a big say in making that popular with Patchwork and A Feast for Odin, and a lot of his games that came afterwards as well. But the resource wheel, I feel like, has not had that similar impact, and it mostly comes in a way of tracking your resources and making sure that they are accounted for in a unique way. But a lot of gameplay can surround these, such as in Glass Road, where if you do have one, you have two resource wheels, and if on one wheel have one of each standard goods, you automatically create an upgraded good in brick or glass. A similar thing can happen in Oranienburger Canal. In Ora et Labora, you're not only using the wheel to keep track of the same method of how you might keep track of resources in Agricola or Caverna. Instead of piling up resources individually on these worker placement spots that you would in the original game, you have only one resource meeple or token that represents that resource on the wheel, and as the turns go by, the dial moves forward, and therefore it tells you exactly how many of that resource is available. And so it's a very neat way, an organized way of keeping track of resources, but it also tells you when to flip over certain building cards to be available next to be built and stuff. And so a lot of cool uses there that in all three of these games that I haven't really seen in many other games outside of Rosenberg games. And so I really enjoy the resource wheel and think it should be more widely used. Number 6 for me is the rags to riches feeling that I get when playing this game. And this is represented by negative points. Now, a lot of these games, or at least the idea of going from rags to riches, can be found in other economic style games, right? It's not unique to Uwe Rosenberg, but I like, and I feel like it's unique the way that his games are representing this rags to riches feeling in the form of negative points, right? In A Feast for Odin, you start with like negative 100, over negative 100 points. And over the course of the game, you end up with a good score, scoring, around 130 or more. And if you play it really well. Usually it's just above 100 or so if you play it average, like I do. And so you can represent this by saying everyone starts at 0, and you can score up to 200 plus points during a game, or you can include negative points on boards that create a puzzle of playing down your polyominoes in a way that you feel like not only should you play them down to gain you points and increase your income, but also to play them strategically to cover up those negative points and essentially gain you, extra points as you move along. These negative points aren't unique to A Feast for Odin. You see these in other games like Agricola if you don't have a diverse resource accumulation throughout the game. If you're missing grain or cattle, etc., you do suffer negative points, right? You suffer negative points if you don't feed your family or your workers. And so, or if you don't cover up certain spaces in various other games like Fields of Arle and Newsfeared as well. And so oftentimes, if you're just looking at the score, and I think this was well represented when you played on Board Game Arena, it may not be as apparent if you play it in person, but as you play through these games, at the start of the game, you are well into the negative points, and you wonder how you can eventually gain enough points to not only cross the threshold of 0, but go well past it and well past the negative mark that you started at, right? And so the explosiveness of points that come through his games after starting with so little, I think is a miracle of design that I've seen designed over and over again with his games. And I think the game that really typifies this to me too is Le Havre. I think you struggle so hard at the beginning of that game to create a food engine and to just keep your head above water to fulfill the feeding requirements, and oftentimes needing to take loans to do so. But as you progress through the game and increase your own wealth, gain buildings for yourself and ships, etc., you develop a way to not only just feed yourself, but also to thrive and end the game with a lot of wealth and points. And I love how this kind of reflects personally with my own life and my journey to becoming a physician, but also this may be true for many other people as well, with, regardless of your occupation or your life story. And I think this can hit true for a lot of us who kind of fall into this background where you start with very little in life, but as you work hard and make wise choices, you end up, becoming more, you survive, but you also thrive, right? And hopefully that's the case for most of us as we go through life itself. I know life is different and challenging for all of us, but hopefully we can mirror our own personal lives in the way that these board games tend to end up, right? Where you do struggle at first, but eventually survive and thrive near the end game and create somewhat of a miracle out of seemingly nothing that you start off with, right? Agricola just typifies this with, you start with 2 people and 2 rooms, and that's it. And you gather enough resources and build them out to create a beautiful tableau with lots of points, lots of pastures and farms and crops and animals and cards as well that you've played from your hand. And to make it just, it's just a miracle every time that I play it. And this is reflected in the final score, going from negative to positive. And so that rags to riches feeling
is something that I really enjoy about his games. Number 7 is going to be the individuality of cards and tiles. A lot of my favorite games of his include a varied and very large deck of cards or tiles. Agricola started this off with, hundreds of cards just in the base game. Maybe 200 or so, I forget. But just in the base game alone, when it was released, you have just a huge deck of cards at different complexities that you could play with, and the fact that the deck was so large and so varied made that game replayable, let alone the competitiveness of the game and mastering those cards, leading to people playing this game thousands of times, is what initially drawed me to that game, in addition to the theme and everything, but is one of the core reasons why Agricola is my favorite game, and I've touched on that before in the podcast. But a lot of his games, you go from A Feast for Odin with a lot of the occupations cards, right? You have Newsfjord with a lot of the building tiles or cards that you play, Glass Road with the tiles. Lately with Oranienburger Canal, you have 6 decks that you can toy around with. Hallertau has a ton of different cards there. Each of them are unique and offer a different ability or reward if you fulfill those objectives. Even at Iwa, the variety isn't as large and it doesn't have as much of a volume as, say, his other games do. But there's just enough to make it feel different every time, and you see things come out in a different order, and you don't tend to see everything at once. But each of the terrain tiles in Ediwa do have, not only the artwork is fun sometimes, like the haunted house, right, where you have one house in the middle that I think you can't play any family in, but that has a unique and individual characteristic of that card. And if I tell you what that card is, you just say, oh yeah, that haunted house card in Agricola or in Ediwa. It's like, oh yeah, I know exactly what that does. Or if you say assistant tiller, and you talk about it, you know exactly what it does. You can almost picture the Clemens Franz art on that card as well, right? It gives it character. And that is something that I miss in a lot of games that offer and boast replayability because of the variety of cards or tiles that are in the game. But they all are just kind of variations on, giving or receiving resources in that game or altering actions, right? In Agricola, for example, a lot of these cards, as the name implies, has something to do with how they alter and manipulate the game themselves, but they do so in a very thematic way. And that is something that makes it feel individual. A lot of games, too, that offer a wide variety of individual cards, such as Ark Nova, Wingspan, Terraforming Mars, oftentimes some of these the thematic ties with what the card is comes through, but sometimes it doesn't, and it's just abstracted. And even though each card is unique, sometimes that uniqueness and individuality that comes with each card kind of fails to thematically integrate for me, thus falling a little bit short of just how much I enjoy it, and compare it to games like Agricola, where every card has an identity and can do something different, but thematically it makes sense based off of what the card or tile is named after. And so there are very few games that I feel like achieve this sense of thematic and mechanical integration with each individual card. And so that is just one of the top reasons, I think, is why I come back to Uwe Rosenberg games and hope, and this is my gold standard to comparing his games and how individual his cards are to other games that boast the similar types of cards as well. Number 8, length of play. Like even his heaviest games, like A Feast for Odin or Agricola or Fields of Arla, I think can be played in a manageable amount of time. I haven't had too much of a difficulty teaching and playing these games within a weekday board game night. We may, depending on how early we get, playing, I think the time differences can vary, but there are, a lot of games nowadays, Euro-style games, that do take a long time to teach and a long time to play, and I'm looking at Ark Nova. But All in all, on average, I feel like Uwe Rosenberg's games, rule-wise, become more medium to medium heavy in the way that they are complex and the way that they are taught. And then the actual gameplay as well can be quick. As soon as you play around in it, it starts to click, and you can get one of those games done usually in a board game night. And so you don't have to wait until a weekend where you have more time or anything like that to really play that game in a considerable amount of time. I think, so on average, I think I really enjoy his length of play time for these games. And as far as the BGG weight complexity as well, they usually fall in that realm that I find just this hits the sweet spot somewhere between 3.5 and 4. So number 9 is the chess-like nature of his games, particularly with games such as Caverna, Fields of Arle, and so we'll primarily talk, and Orat Labora I think is the top contender for this particular style of play. But a lot of his games, particularly these 3, are more sandbox in nature compared to some of his other games, where in Caverna all of the tiles are laid out in front of you. The only sense of randomness comes in the order of which actions you can do in each round, and what kind of harvest you can have as well if you play with that. And so, but the meat of the game is laid out in front of you completely, and it's up to you to navigate that. And as you navigate that and start to play it over and over again, as you start to play Caverna over and over again, or Fields of Arle, A Feast for Odin too, I'll make the argument there, and Orat Labora, the same patterns start to play out, the same strategies and dominant strategies start to play out as well. And things slowly start to become more chess-like as you gain experience and competitiveness in each of these games. I wish that Orat Labora was more widely available digitally, so I could really dive into it myself and watch other people dive into it as well. But it almost becomes a solvable game where once you have played it enough times, you know which strategy lines are the most efficient and the best to do. And if you are playing with other people who understand that as well, then a second tier of gaming occurs, where you start to utilize some of the other unique worker placement spots or actions or buildings, etc., to try to circumnavigate that particular play line to make it so you're still competitive. As you do with chess, right? You have different strategies and different defenses or attacks, etc. And I think it's probably not as it probably is not as close to chess as I'm making it out to be when you are playing games like Orat Labora, because of the abstract nature of chess. But the fact that you can kind of achieve that chess-like nature of gameplay with these heavy, medium heavy to heavy Euro games with thematic integration with mechanisms that I've mentioned before, makes it really interesting and very competitive, right? And so I think a part of this reason is that these chess-like games, or if you take chess itself, it's probably the most competitive board game there is in the world. People study this game. These games can become lifestyle games. And for me, this is why Uwe Rosenberg games are so replayable, is because I can see myself getting better at these games. It takes a lot of repetition to become good at these games, but then you look at like Agricola and all of these other games and see how far ahead some of the best players are when it comes to scoring and the consistency of having high scores as well. Just shows you how high the skill ceiling is. And so having a really high skill ceiling, I think, equates itself pretty closely to chess. And so a lot of these games, while they may feel sandboxy and feel samey as well, because everything is laid out in front of you, all the tiles in Caverna are there in front of you to choose from, then, or at Labora, the same buildings are coming out at the same times. And so it's like, what kind of, there aren't any surprises that I see in these games. And so why do I keep coming back to it? Well, I think it's because of the competitiveness of chess and that mindset that you bring to a game that you've played over and over again and know exactly what is coming at this point and later on down the road and how you react to it and how your opponent reacts to it as well. You slowly start to play the player and not just the game. And so that meta arises in games that are like chess. And this is true for a lot of other games that I've mentioned before on the podcast, like Terra Mystica, etc. But I feel like a wide variety of Uwe Rosenberg's games can achieve that chess-like nature when it comes to strategy and competitiveness. And so that is a major reason why I love these games. And then finally, my last reason is the variety of complexity and weight that his games include. We have light games such as Bonanza, a lot of the two-player spin-offs of his major titles lately with Tangram City and some of his other polyomino games or tile lane games that are just easier for people to get into. I can play these games with friends and family who don't play a lot of board games, and so it's easier for me to introduce them to certain mechanisms like polyomino tile or tile placement, right? Maybe even some worker placement as well for more medium weight games like Newsfjord or At the Gates of Loyang, for example. Maybe that's a heavier example than I intended, but you have those, and then you have the Agricola, you have the A Feast for Odin, which pushes that heavyweight, complexity on Board Game Geek, and so you have a game that kind of fits a lot of different situations that you might be placed in for board gaming, and some designers can do this very well. A lot of the most popular designers have games that can fit at every level of experience or time, or just gameplay preference, and that ultimately what helps me enjoy Uwe Rosenberg games even more is that I can fit in a Patchwork or Bonanza where I can, as well as saving those longer and juicier games for those special moments, as well as playing them digitally as well over weeks, versus maybe a couple of days with Patchwork or something. And so a game for every occasion, I think, is awesome, and I've really enjoyed his catalog of games. And as a whole, the things that I find fun, some games are more fun-forward and are more lighthearted, and that definitely serves a purpose in gaming, as well as the more competitive ones. And so having a bit of each and having that opportunity to play a lot of these different types of games from the same designer helps me feel more preference and favoritism towards his games. And so to cap it all off, just the variety of different games that I find enjoyable for mechanisms or theme or otherwise, and for all the reasons that I've listed above, are reasons why Uwe Rosenberg's games are my favorite and why they feel unique to me.